Okay, I think we can get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kelt Wilska, and I'm the Offshore Wind Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, where on behalf of ELM, I lead New England for Offshore Wind, a growing coalition of over 100 environmental nonprofits, labor unions, educational institutions, and business associations, all working together to ensure that offshore wind is developed responsibly and equitably off our region's coast. I want to start by sincerely thanking our brilliant panelists for being willing to join us today to share their expertise on this very timely and exciting topic of bidirectional transmission between the U.S. Northeast and Eastern Canada, and also Senator Ed Markey, climate champion, for sharing some recorded remarks to frame today's discussion. And finally, I want to give a huge thanks to our Rockstar Coalition partner, the Acadia Center, for co-hosting today's webinar with us. Acadia is a policy powerhouse doing the critical work to accelerate the clean energy transition in New England and beyond. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over now to your guide and moderator for today's discussion, Jamie Dickerson, Senior Director of Climate and Clean Energy Programs at the Acadia Center. Jamie, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelt, and thanks to all for joining us today, including our friends and colleagues in both the US and Canada, and especially to policymakers, regulators, government officials, tribal leaders who've all taken time out of your busy days to be here. So thank you. Kelt just introduced me. It's great to be here. We're so pleased that this top-notch panel was able to come together for the discussion today. We'll do full intros later on, but it's going to be a real treat to hear from our panelists, have some moderated Q&A, and then open Q&A from the audience. So get your questions ready to add via Zoom. I will note the webinar will be recorded and shared along with slides after the fact. And yeah, Kelt, right back at you. It's been great to partner with ELM and New England for Offshore Wind on this webinar. So thanks for your partnership. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. And in fact, one right after that, to officially kick us off, we're very fortunate to have welcome remarks from the Honorable U.S. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts, who's been a longstanding climate champion. So let's hear from him now.
To the Environmental League of Massachusetts and New England for Offshore Wind for putting this event together. Our power grid has evolved countless times since the birth of the power industry. Demand has skyrocketed. Distributed generation has swept the nation. Complex transmission networks and smart grid technologies have emerged, and the clean energy revolution is here at our doorstep. However, instead of an open, transparent, reliable, renewable energy superhighway for the modern era, our grid is an inaccessible one-lane road from the Model T era. We must deliver a 21st century grid for every household, including by planning and building better transmission networks to meet our power needs while improving reliability and keeping costs low. That's why I've introduced the Charge Act, which would help us do just that. Bidirectional and interregional transmission ensures that we can keep the lights on without having to also switch on polluted fossil fuels. Power that spans states and regions creates a mutually beneficial network, transferring clean generation where and when it's needed, and we must also deliver. And we don't have to double the rate at which they're succeeding. We have to double the rate at which we're going to move forward over the next 10 years using the Inflation Reduction Act. New England is already a leader in the clean energy transition. Just a few weeks ago, Governor Healy announced more than 2,600 megawatts of future offshore wind capacity that will power 1.4 million homes. But we've still got a lot more to do to transform this grid from Edison's grid to everyone's grid. And I'm committed to fighting for a grid that reflects the tenets of the Green New Deal, ambitious and transformational, with union jobs, environmental justice, and climate action at its core. And I look forward to working with all of you for a cleaner, greener, and more fair energy future. Thank you all for everything that you do every single day. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you again to Senator Markey for helping set the stage for today's discussion. Also to your staff for attending today and for all your leadership on clean energy. I think we're going to have to borrow that Edison's grid, everyone's grid line for our own work. So yeah, Acadia Center, as Kelt briefly mentioned, is a regional climate nonprofit. We're based in Maine, working across the full Northeast. We're very proud to have brought our data-driven approach to policy debates in the region for the last 25 plus years. Our mission, as you can see, is to advance bold, effective, equitable, clean energy solutions, such as the very topic we're here to discuss today. So next slide, please. And what is that topic? Well, it's the concept of bidirectional electricity trade and why it matters for priorities like offshore wind. This concept really requires us to think not only about the local grid that serves us, but how we plan, coordinate, and cooperate with our neighboring regions for mutual benefit. So we're going to need our interregional and, in fact, international hats on today for sure. And we're focused on a macro region of pretty significant size and importance. New England, New York, the Eastern Canadian provinces, even some of the mid-Atlantic states as well by extension. In fact, by the way, the Canadian provinces we're talking about contain 70% of Canada's population and energy demand. This geographic footprint corresponds very closely to the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, NPCC, which is a regional reliability entity under NERC, which is very convenient. So in short, adopting a bidirectional planning approach affords us the opportunity for the region's whole to become greater than the sum of its parts, which otherwise might look like the states and provinces and their respective system operators acting by themselves. So today's panel is really going to help us illustrate how the bidirectional approach can deliver a more secure, affordable, clean energy future, optimizing our transmission investments and costs, avoiding overbuild, enhancing reliability and resilience to extreme weather events, and opening new markets for energy trade for resources like offshore wind. So next slide, please. Just briefly, Acadia Center, we've been working on this issue as part of the NGPF project, the Northeast Grid Planning Forum. It's a relatively new cross-border project of ours that we are convening with our Canadian partners at Energica. We're focused on setting up inclusive planning dialogues, bringing together government officials, community, and environmental stakeholders, and the clean energy industry to get into issues like the one we're talking about today. So please check out our framing paper and reach out to us if you'd like to get more engaged there. Next slide, please. This is a busy map from our NGPF work, but focus on the shiny two-way arrows that really encapsulate the bidirectional exchange that we're talking about. There is rapidly growing demand for clean power, and despite large reserves in Canada, there's been a notable shift in posture away from abundance and toward even scarcity for Canadian hydro resources. Bidirectionality helps ease and address that trend and unlocks connectivity between the significant offshore wind resource potential off the US and Canadian coastlines and those existing hydro resources, helping them act more like a big battery for the region rather than a purely a baseload or always on resource. Now, I do want to note this conversation represents a shift away from the legacy cross-border discussions from 10 or even 5 years ago, when the focus was primarily on north to south power flows and bringing electrons one way down to the load centers of New England and New York. That was necessary and valuable, but this is about taking the next step and doing so holistically. I think we can click one more on the slide. And indeed, this equation is not just about supply or generation resources. Energy efficiency, the demand side, holds huge untapped potential in this region as well, which is also going to help ease strains on those existing resources. For instance, 58% thereabouts of Quebec households heat with electric baseboard heating, more than 2 million households. At least in New England, in our climate zones, if you switch from electric resistance heat to a heat pump, you can save as much as 65% annually in terms of the kilowatt hours that you consume. So there's huge untapped saving to tap into. Next slide, please. This is another map. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but it shows the existing transmission lines in this region and some of the interregional transfer capabilities as they stand today from the recent NERC report, which many of you may have seen. So there already are some connections. There already is some notable import and export trade. In New England, 13 seems to be the magic number for some reason. 13% of ISO New England's energy needs were met by imports in 2023. And there are 13 existing transmission interconnections to electricity systems in New York and Eastern Canada. So this is about stitching that together in a more holistic fashion. So I have two final slides, which I'll hit very quickly. On the next slide, just to put a finer point on why bidirectionality matters for offshore wind, keep in mind the benefits of expanding the market, ensuring access to willing buyers on a year-round basis, optimizing costs and cost sharing across multiple parties and jurisdictions, reducing the risk of curtailment of surplus generation, unbottling power that might otherwise compete with itself within a local market, and really balancing the variability that's inherent in wind production with complementary resources to effectively create region-wide clean, firm capacity. So you can see some of those attributes called out on the quotes from Massachusetts long-term climate plans and decarb roadmaps as well. So finally, on the next slide, the solution may not be all that sexy, but we know what it is, and it centers around better planning. At a regional, interregional, national, and international level, we have to talk together more. It starts with something as simple as that, and then we get into joint modeling, joint planning, joint procurement, and beyond. I don't have time to go through all the moving pieces that you see on the slide here, but there is a lot going on right now, and it's all moving in the right direction. The New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers came together just last month and renewed commitments toward collaboration in this arena. The Northeast states, through their collaborative on interregional transmission, has been leading tremendously important dialogue on their own, including via a new HVDC offshore wind transmission white paper just last week. And just this week, I believe, Canada just passed a new law that is poised to open up Atlantic Canada's offshore wind opportunities off Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, the C49 law, as it's called. So it's happening. It's happening in pieces, and now it's about stitching it all together. So without any further ado, that's it from me. Let's shift over to our illustrious panelists, who I might add bring a stellar international flair to the discussion. I'm going to quickly run through their bios now to expedite the transitions between their presentations. So first up, we're going to hear from Emil Dmanchev, who's a research affiliate at the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, CEPR. He's finishing his PhD in Norway, and we're very lucky that he's going to be an incoming postdoc at Princeton's Zero Lab, working with Jesse Jenkins and the team there pretty soon. After Emil, we'll hear from Hannes Pfeifenberger, a principal at the Brattle Group. He's an economist with a background in electrical engineering, and if you're familiar to this space, you know that he's a rock star on anything from wholesale power market design, transmission, renewables, and beyond. He's also affiliated with CEPR, BU's Institute for Sustainable Energy. He's a senior member at IEEE and a number of other prestigious institutions. Finally, we're going to hear from Adrian Downey, who's the principal engineer and country manager for floating offshore wind developer Hexacon in the US and Canada, and also supporting Hexacon's global portfolio across the world. Prior to that, Adrian served as principal engineer for offshore wind at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, where you may know that she and I used to be colleagues and were thick as thieves back in the day, and she's now also expanding her work with Power Advisory. So without real further ado, let's go to our next slide, and we're going to hear from Emil first. Over to you, Emil.
Thanks, Jamie, and hello to everyone. At the outset, I have to say I hope you can bear with me as I'm recovering from a cold, but I'm very happy to be with you all nonetheless. So both Jamie and Senator Markey highlighted the imperative of building a better power system, and I'll try to follow that up with some reflections on what that might look like. The perspective I'll be taking is that of system planning, where we use power system models to understand how to cost effectively plan and operate the power system for a future year like 2050, when we want to reach certain climate goals. one of the values of this kind of modeling is that it can show us how different technologies can come together, what their roles, synergies, and trade-offs are. We have done such modeling with colleagues at MIT CEPR, and I'll be showing you some of our main results from that study in the next few slides. We have enjoyed discussing this study and our work with many of you over the last few years. So the slides I'll be showing reflect some of the conversations we've had and highlight some important aspects of this problem that may be underappreciated. Next slide, please. One of the main findings of our research is that in a low carbon power system in New England and Quebec, building additional transmission between the regions will help us lower the costs of electricity. This is the case across various scenarios that we have modeled. What I want to highlight here is that we have envisioned a scenario where New England decarbonizes by a significant amount, where load increases by 50%, that's 50, by 2050, and is a winter peaking system. Even in that case, we see that building transmission to Quebec decreases the costs of decarbonization, as shown in the negative values here. Next slide, please. Transmission is valuable because, much as Jamie said, it allows us to trade energy bidirectionally. That's the case both for the existing transmission that we have, which is shown in blue in these figures, which will be optimally operated in a bidirectional way in order to balance renewable intermittency. And when we build new transmission, that is valuable because it allows us to do more bidirectional trading and more balancing. This is true both on a daily resolution, which is shown on the top, and importantly, on a seasonal resolution, which is shown on the bottom. Next slide, please. Bidirectional trading is beneficial because it helps us balance renewable intermittency. We might imagine that in certain periods in the future, like shown on the left, we will have low renewable output in New England. And in those periods, we can use the flexibility of the Quebec hydropower resource to ramp up production from hydropower reservoirs and import energy from Quebec into New England. In other periods, we will have excess renewable production in New England, and instead of curtailing it, it will be optimal to export that energy to Quebec. The special feature of the Quebec power system is that by importing energy from New England, Hydro-Quebec can withhold production from its reservoirs and store more of the water behind their dams, which would act as a kind of long-duration energy storage, and then be able to be used later when in New England we once again have a shortfall of renewable output. Next slide, please. So bidirectional power trading has multiple benefits. As I've mentioned, it lowers the costs of decarbonization. A lot of that comes from decreasing costs that come from burning natural gas and building new gas plants. So we see that if we expand transmission, we will have a lower dependence on natural gas, which might be particularly relevant in the wake of the 2022 gas crisis. That means lower CO2 emissions in New England, and it also means less curtailment of renewables, as Jamie mentioned. For example, in some of our scenarios, we see that if we do not expand transmission, we might have to significantly curtail our wind. In this case, we see a 7% curtailment in the spring and in the fall, but 4 gigawatts of additional transmission is enough to eliminate that. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to address a kind of common thing we hear about bidirectional trading and whether that is challenged by the fact that as New England decarbonizes and electrifies, it will become winter peaking. So on the one hand, when both Quebec and New England are winter peaking, their demands are more correlated, so we need energy at the same time. And you might think that bidirectional trading is less valuable. However, I would challenge that and actually advocate for using a different metric. And namely, I mean, rather than look at demand, we should be looking at net demand, which is load minus renewable output. And as illustrated in a very simple case in the lower figure, we find that net demand is less well correlated between the regions. So, for example, you might imagine that both regions might have high demand in some period, but in the same period, offshore wind production in New England might be very high. So what that means is that the two regions still benefit from trading energy, which would once again help us balance the power systems on both sides of the border. So with that, thank you very much.
Marvelous. Thank you again, Emil. Great presentation. Yeah, right over to you, Hannes. Take it away.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. This was set up beautifully. So what I like to do is get a little bit at the transmission planning question and how can we plan cost-effective transmission between Canada and the Northeast. Next slide, please. So we talk a lot about offshore wind, and currently we have between 30 and 50 gigawatts of offshore wind planned, or at least targeted by the northeastern states. ISO New England, New York, and PJM, which is really part of the Northeast as well. And there's a lot of talk about planning on how can we get to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. However, we also know that to meet decarbonization objectives of the states, we need a lot more than those current targets. And we might need 100 or 200 gigawatts of offshore wind just in the Northeast. And it's important to keep those long-term needs in mind in the planning process, because as we plan our next steps, these next steps will be better steps if we know where we're going long-term. How can you take, the first 3 steps if you don't know where you want to end up 10 steps from now? Now, this is all a little bit more challenged with the supply chain challenges. And we probably see some of our targets slip beyond 2030 by a few years as the supply chain is catching up. But those long-term targets that we have, as shown in this chart, are still very important. And we need to figure out how to get to the long term as we plan for the near term. Next slide, please. And some of these planning studies really tell us a lot about the kind of transmission system we might ultimately need that not just brings offshore wind to shore, but also connects the different power regions with each other, like New York, New England, and PJM. Many of the studies do not include Canada, but luckily there are some studies that include Canada, and those studies show that an additional 4 to 7 gigawatts or 4 to 7,000 megawatts of new transmission will likely be needed and cost effective between New England and Canada, and the same for New York and Canada. So we are having some studies that tell us that bidirectional transmission will be cost effective in the future between the Northeast and Canada. Next slide, please. And there's another study. Emil has already talked about the MIT study. This is the Massachusetts Decarbonization Pathway Study. And the chart in here shows that by 2040, it is expected that imports and exports between New England and the neighboring regions will be roughly balanced. So it's truly bidirectional. By 2050, this will be a lot more, but importantly, the size of these exchanges, even by 2030, exceed the currently available transfer capability. Certainly by 2040, we would need more transmission capacity. And the table here shows that the optimal level might be about 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts between Massachusetts and Quebec, and between 4,000 and 6,000 or 7,000 megawatts between New York and Quebec, because the Quebec system basically can be a big battery for the entire Northeast. Next slide, please. So now that we have all these studies, how can we actually get transmission planned? And that's a real challenge. Just because we have studies telling us that more transmission would be beneficial doesn't mean we can get transmission projects planned and permitted. And that's in large part driven by the fact that the transmission planning process is really quite balkanized. I won't get to go through all of these boxes here, but basically these 7 boxes represent 7 different transmission planning processes that are used for different regions, and each of these boxes is building transmission for its own incremental need. And we just can't get to a cost-effective grid unless we consolidate these boxes here and plan more holistically, including across the planning regions. New England, for example, is its own transmission planning region, and interregional planning, such as between New England and New York or New England and Canada, just doesn't exist right now. Yet we need to get there to make these visions laid out by these studies a reality. Next slide, please. We've done a survey a few years ago on what is holding us back from interregional transmission. And the reality is there are significant barriers. There is a lack of leadership, understanding, sometimes trust between the regions. There are planning tools that each region is using that are just not up to snuff for good holistic interregional planning. And of course, regulatory constraints, tariffs, and needs of certification, permitting, siting. This is very challenging for any type of transmission, but it's even more challenging for interregional transmission. And we did, in the report cited here, make some recommendations on how to address these barriers, but we won't have time now. Next slide. So what are the benefits of more proactive, holistic, and multi-value planning? Multi-value means addressing multiple needs, multiple benefits, capturing multiple benefits at the same time, rather than trying to plan the grid more incrementally. The best planning processes will holistically consider all the transmission needs, not just the transmission needs for offshore wind, but also the transmission needs for onshore wind in Maine, for the exchanges that are so valuable with neighboring regions, for generation interconnection, creating headroom on the grid to interconnect generators and reduce congestion. So that kind of holistic planning really would make a big difference, and we don't do much of that right now. And that kind of proactive multi-value, multi-driver, multi-need planning needs to address both the urgent near-term needs and the long-term needs. What we're talking about here is if there's an urgent near-term need, like to interconnect offshore wind or to upgrade the transmission system because a plant is retiring, we might have 5 different solutions to address that problem. But one of those solutions might also relieve congestion and create interregional transfer capability. So we need to think in multiple dimensions of what the grid can do for us to select the best solutions, both in the near term and the long term. We can't do it incrementally through the generation interconnection process, and we need to look beyond the regional seams. Advanced transmission technologies can reduce the cost of those projects, and on cost allocation, who pays for what, we need to be pragmatic and not formulaic about it. And the last slide, please. Actually, this is just an example of a good holistic planning process that Europe is using for continent-wide planning. Next slide, please. And I just want to leave you with a challenge and a message, and that is that to achieve an affordable clean energy transition, we need to work much harder at identifying lower cost solutions, because nobody will be happy if costs increase beyond a certain level. It's bad for customers, it's bad for policymakers, but it's also bad for the utilities and the generators. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Great stuff as always. Very much appreciated. So yeah, last but not least, let's turn it to Adrienne Downey now. Take it away, Adrienne.
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie. Appreciate it. And glad to be here with the Acadia Center and my esteemed colleagues. It's great to see everyone again. So I'm Adrienne Downey, as Jamie indicated in the intro. I have been working in the renewable space for close to 15, well, more than 15 years at this point, and both sides of the border, Canada and US. I'm a Canadian originally, and have lived coast to coast, from Goose Bay, Labrador through Chilliwack, BC, and just about everywhere in between, and now call New York City home, where I've had the opportunity to work extensively on offshore wind for the past couple of years. So you'll have to indulge a little bit of bias in this presentation, but if we can dive into it. We can look at the next slide, please. And want to reiterate some of the messages that both Emil and Hannes very aptly alluded to, which is that the enormity of the challenge of achieving our East Coast U.S. clean targets is enormous. And what I would emphasize, in addition to what they have conveyed, is the enormity of the acceleration in this trend. So it's not only the goals in their absolute sense, but we're seeing that all of our prognoses, looking at 2040, 2050, that load growth is going to be rapidly upon us, and so that all the more emphasizes our need to focus on proactive planning, per Hannes' suggestion. So at the end of the day, winter is coming, and having lived in Montreal for the better part of 10 years, thinking about those baseboard heaters, like it's real. And the acceleration of those challenges is only going to be growing. So if we can look at the next slide, please. Yeah, so when we look at Eastern Canada, it's really not much easier. And I think what's important to reflect upon is this role of the interconnectedness of the ability to achieve those goals in the East are very much predicated upon an integrated view of the U.S. Northeast and Eastern Canada. But when we look at the regions in particular and focus here, it's really not much easier. Quebec, as Emil has alluded to, is strapped on its potential to deliver on this. And likewise, Jamie, in your introduction, you very much highlighted this. Last year, almost 21.5 gigawatts of new capacity was denied the opportunity to interconnect, which speaks to repercussions with regards to economic development and electrification in industry, that is going to be challenged by not embracing the extent of the needs that we're facing. So that is again an allusion to the acceleration of the trend that we're seeing. And so we've got a lot of interconnections that already exist in Atlantic Canada, and those that are additionally proposed. And where I'll conclude in today's presentation is actually looking in particular, folks may have heard of the Atlantic Loop, right, which is really the culmination of many of the transmission pathways that are shown here in this image. And part of what the argument is, and I think very much to Hannes's point, is that that may actually be an endeavor that is too small for the challenge that is needed, and that we need to think more expansively about the role of north-south connections. But fortunately, as you can also see from the graphic, everywhere that there are little tickers players on each of the borders. We've done this before. So it's not the first time that we've had transmission development between the US and Canada. In fact, you could argue that there are more interconnections north-south within the Canadian-US borders electrically than there are east-west within Canada. So this is achievable. And we've seen progress in a number of recent important initiatives, notably with the delivery of Hydro-Quebec's generation and transmission, bidirectional transmission into New York City. But obviously we need more. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So offshore wind is pretty much a match made in heaven with this load growth and with the winter peaks. And both Emil and Hannes very astutely demonstrated, really the intersectionality of these different technologies. So looking at hydro and the opportunity to replenish reserves by harnessing offshore wind, really this is the match that is going to bring us close to fulfilling our goals, but not without challenges, right? So we're seeing all of the development on the east coast of the United States with additional lease auctions anticipated as well in the coming weeks in the Gulf of Maine for an additional up to 13 gigawatts of offshore wind lease capacity, and delighted, as Jamie alluded in Bill C-49 at the passage this week of seeking additional opportunities to harness offshore wind in Atlantic Canada. So this is a ripe space for us to be not only developing, offshore wind is not for offshore wind's sake. It's really about bringing a compatible portfolio of solutions together that are complementary, and that the not only the reliability emphasis, but hugely cost reductions through portfolio efficiencies. Next slide. Okay, so where I want to really focus in our last few minutes here before we get to Q&A is on just such a proposal to put forward additional bidirectional transfer. So it's Wednesday, so we're going to call this bidirectional awesomeness to keep it light. But really wanted to forecast that, the New England Maritime Offshore Energy Corridor, or NEMOEC, as it has been called, was a very exciting collaboration. So I'm here today representing both Hexacon and Power Advisory, given that we collaborated extensively on the development together with a consortium to look, in detail at what this could look like in terms of great potential. But also, looking at the cost benefits and economics. And, the result was going from, the modeling that we've seen from Hannes and from Emil, and actually looking at, the constructability and what that would look like in terms of total cost and system benefits. And the result was looking at the potential of 5 gigawatts and integrating that with the 13 gigawatts in the Gulf of Maine. So forging that connection would pay for itself with an additional benefit of $780 million a year in greenhouse gas reductions. And so very much to echo Hannes's point, it's really a question of proactive planning. Again, we've done this before, we can do it again, and the urgency is growing. So I think it's a great opportunity to share that these types of concepts, these proposals, it's not a project yet, unfortunately, but hopefully soon, are being, pardon the pun, floated. And we look forward to engaging in the discussion. So I think that wraps me up, Jamie, and we can turn it over to the panel.
Amazing. Thank you, Adrian. Great stuff as always. So it's 12:42. We have about 18 minutes till the top of the hour, and then we have some spillover time, office hours till 1:15 for those who are able to stay on with us for the remainder of the time. So we're going to start with a few moderated Q&A items before we go into the great audience Q&A questions that have been submitted. So keep those coming in the meantime. There's a lot of places where we could start. Obviously, we've heard that bidirectionality and offshore wind matters for cost, for reliability, pace of decarbonization, the optimization of the resource mix. I guess I want to start with reliability. Obviously, the storms in Florida in recent weeks have everyone thinking about what the changing impacts of climate will mean for extreme weather resilience and reliability of our grid. What can our panelists tell us about how bidirectional transmission capacity and coordination can do to improve reliability and resilience outcomes? Obviously, weather affects the whole region to some extent, but how correlated is it? And does strengthening the ties between regions help us with reliability?
Well, maybe I could say that the intuition behind that is that as we rely on offshore wind and solar and other weather-dependent resources, the size of the grid needs to exceed the size of large weather systems. Now, it's possible that entire Northeast is in a snowstorm, and Canada is affected by it too. But as you might have noticed, snowstorms, when they come through New England, they might end up in Canada a day or two later. And that day or two really makes where bidirectional transmission can make a big difference, not just to the north, but also to the west of us. So Emil talked about correlations, and what happens is that from a load perspective and from a renewable resource generation perspective, creating a larger footprint for the grid diversifies these risks, and that's what creates reliability risks.
Yeah, and I can follow that up by, kind of reflecting on the fact that so transmission gives us two things at least in terms of reliability. One is access to the hydro resource, which is relatively flexible, and it can compete with the natural gas resources that we have and currently rely on to some degree. It can compete with that, although there are challenges that we need to address. But also, as Hannes was saying, transmission gives us this ability to combine wind resources from both sides of the border, which together are much more reliable than alone. Going back to the hydro resource and the reliability of the hydro power resource, that is something that I think raises some important questions about the ability to which ISO New England can truly rely on out-of-state and out-of-country resources, and raises questions about information sharing, maybe that we need to sort of address together with everybody in the room, including Hydro-Quebec and ISO New England, the resources that are in state and have to participate in capacity markets and that we have to rely on. They share a lot of information with the grid operator. To the extent that we want Hydro-Quebec to be on the same level of reliance, we might need to be much closer integrated than we currently are.
I would just add, if I can, Jamie, that I think the question of reliability is clearly important, but we also need to be thinking about this in terms of resiliency, right? So bringing in the function of climate change and climate adaptation that is already happening. So the extent to which the diversity of the portfolio, the range, as Hannes described, and Emil likewise, in geography and being able to harness those resources, all extremely important. But also, let's take into account the circumstances of increasing frequency and severity of storms, right? We're seeing the effects of this, unfortunately, right now off the coast of Tampa, coming in the next few days, but also in the Northeast, incredible increases in periods of bad weather, risks of coastal flooding, and thinking about in the case of Quebec, there's a significant portion of the challenges is not just from drawing demand on exports, but also looking at the effects of climate change and the frequency and cumulative snow impact and melt that is changing. So, to the extent that we're thinking about this in terms of reliability on an instantaneous basis, yes, but also thinking about it in terms of resiliency on a broader scale as we collectively adapt in a changing climate.
Great answers all around. I'd like to pivot a little bit to sort of the topic of who has to be at the table and who has to be engaged for this whole process to work. Um, Hannes, you alluded very briefly to the European model that's been set up, so maybe we can start there. But in this region, what is the role of states or provinces? What is the role of the respective federal governments in the US and Canada? And then the roles of other stakeholders, community-based organizations, tribes, environmental justice groups, utilities, system operators, NGOs. It's an open-ended question, but purposefully so, to ask about how we make this happen in reality.
Well, I think you just outlined the scope for another hour-long webinar on that topic. But I think you need everyone on the table. That's why this is so challenging. This isn't something that ISO New England can plan, or New York ISO can plan, or Quebec Hydro-Quebec can plan. You need to get all of those grid planners together. You need to have the states and provinces behind willing to pay for the cost of building transmission, but you need then to plan the transmission. You need to get together with the stakeholders, the tribal nations, and the communities. Otherwise, it just won't happen. I think the first step in getting the people to the table is to make them understand why this is worth doing. Nobody's willing to waste their time on something not worthwhile. So we have to explain why this is important, why this is worthwhile, get people on the table, agree on what optimal transmission plans would look like, and then agree on who pays for them.
Excellent. Any other thoughts on that? If not, I think we can move to some of our audience Q&A.
Well, Jamie, maybe just briefly, thinking in particular about how your invitation to think about this broadly, and I couldn't agree more with Hannes as to the need to clearly articulate the value. I mean, these are investments. There is a return to ratepayers through the investments that we're talking about today. But it's also extremely important to be considering the stakeholder elements. There have been, as we all know, many projects over the past number of years that have been proposed, even gotten so far as contracting, and then ultimately stymied in the development and interconnections cross-border, just as we've seen. And that is, I mean, it's a shame, not weighing in either way in terms of the perspectives, but from the perspective of just looking technically and looking at the cost opportunities and benefits that could be unlocked for the region, that side of the stakeholder engagement hasn't been, I don't think, as prioritized as it needs to be. And these are lessons that have been hard learned in many provinces across Canada, and also in states across the Northeast, that if we don't simultaneously bring technocratic arguments with real genuine stakeholder engagement early in the process, then it's very difficult to bring together the coalition of yes, both from a government regulatory sort of top-down perspective, but also to be encouraging it from the bottom up. And that's where I think there's a lot of combined leadership, but also excellent emphasis on stakeholder benefits that needs to be better articulated in order to see these projects through the finish line.
Great, very well put. We got a great audience Q&A that was actually on our list of pre-planned Q&A, so I'm going to use that to transition to audience Q&A. And the question is really on market structures and contractual structures that will be needed to actually make this happen. Obviously, we have respective system operators and their respective wholesale markets today. Is there such a thing as an interregional market structure outside of just a bilateral contract that could be set up? What types of things, what might we learn from the European transmission planning process that could unlock, multi-jurisdiction financing of projects and actual, revenue streams flowing? And open to anyone who wants to take that one on.
Well, the interesting thing about Europe is they both have interregional wholesale power markets that can take advantage of any what they call interconnectors between countries, but they also have a continent-wide proactive planning process that can plan those interconnectors. And in some ways, these big interregional projects, unless they are anchored by a export contract, the way Hydro-Quebec has operated in the past with for bidirectional transmission, you don't have these long-term contracts. So you basically need the system operators' commitment to put those transmission into the regulated rates. That means you need regulators on both sides of the border to agree to share cost of any of that. I think that exists in Europe with contractual structures, and then you have the wholesale power markets who can then take advantage of the trading opportunities between the markets. We have the same happening in the Western US, where British Columbia, Bonneville Power, CalISO, they all have created a energy imbalance market that can fully take advantage of the transmission they have between themselves for this kind of trading. We don't quite have that in the East yet, where most of the trading is bilateral. So it's hard for the people who would pay for the line to get the full value of the line unless there's a way, say, through congestion revenues and so on, to get some of that value back to the ratepayers who would be paying for it.
Yeah, and I guess I would add 2 points to that. One about the market that exists between Quebec and New England. Currently, if you ask Hydro-Quebec, my understanding is that if they buy power from New England, they end up paying kind of a retail rate rather than a wholesale rate. They have to contribute to the transmission pool in New England, which is so, wholesale buyers don't have to do that. So that seems like one area that maybe deserves addressing or discussing. Secondly, it seems like an important aspect to this is risk. If we expect investors to build transmission lines and pay them back using differences in local prices, is there a off-taker that would take that risk off and help that investment find financing? I think with Twin State, for example, a project that was meant to provide bidirectional trading, and as far as I understand, was more or less conceptualized on a merchant basis. That didn't work out. So do we have the kind of long-term markets that allow us to make these projects happen? It seems like that is another area that deserves further development.
Yeah, I think the only way to do that is to make them part of the regulated transmission network that has cost recovery associated with that. But if you want to do that, you also need to make sure that the value of what transmission customers are paying for flows back to them and not to third-party traders.
Right.
At the risk of being a little provocative, I think one of the things that really challenges this type of interregional collaboration and forward planning, and I say this very affectionately and endearingly, is the parochialism that exists between different provinces, regions, even within Canada. Likewise, looking south of the border, right? We're all very much fixated upon, our individual grids and our discrete resources, the management thereof, and there's a lot of history and culture that is wrapped up in that, particularly when you think about Hydro-Quebec, right? It's the gem of La Belle Provence, and has always occupied an outsized place in Quebec culture, and so bridge that and to have these sort of broader regional discussions, there's some cultural sensitivity that, curiously enough, we're here talking about, interconnection regions and availability and resource adequacy, and all of those things are important. But it's also important that we think about this as a social and cultural exchange, and with related co-benefits.
Very well articulated. Great point. We are nearing the top of the hour. I'm seeing our participants start to dwindle down a little bit. So just take a brief pause and say thank you again to everyone who joined us for the discussion. You will receive a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides afterwards. And if you have to go, I totally understand it. And thank you again for attending. But for those who are still glued to their seats and interested in more discussion, we've got about 15 to 20 more minutes of Q&A, and we've got some more great audience Q&A to get into. So we're going to turn to that right now. So we talked about the transmission side a lot. I think our audience members are very interested in the generation side, the supply side. So let's unpack hydro first, and then offshore wind next, and maybe get into battery storage after that. We have a couple of questions about, especially in Quebec, Hydro-Quebec's fleet of hydro resources. Are they, in the past, they've said they will not build new dams. Are they considering building new hydro capacity? And relatedly, from like a New England, New York perspective, how do neighboring provinces and states ensure that imports of Canadian hydro are reliable and will be there when called upon? I will note, just sort of as an editorial comment, I think the focus here for the future is probably, if anything, going to be on refurbishing existing dams and upgrading turbines rather than building new dams. It's also important to note that there are abundant non-hydro renewable resources north of the border as well, onshore wind, even a solar tender going out soon, as far as I know. So to our panelists, how would you like to dig into this question of how will the future of Hydro-Quebec's fleet and other Canadian utilities fleets evolve in the future? And how can American traders and counterparties ensure that those deliveries will be reliable?
Yeah, great question, Jamie. If I can start us off, and then Hannes, I saw you eager to join too. And I think this is exactly the crux of the question that Quebec is grappling with, right? The challenges that they're facing on a capacity perspective are catching up quickly, and they are going to need real solutions. And there's a lot of expertise in Hydro-Quebec's generation portfolio towards new hydro. However, the environmental and social outcomes that are associated with large impoundments are untenable, stating it frankly. And that's been part of the challenge that, New York, in importing significant capacity from Hydro-Quebec, looking at that balancing resource and opportunity, particularly with offshore wind development and trying to bring large-scale firm capacity into New York City. A core tenet of its procurement strategy was ensuring that that additional capacity wasn't going to be delivered at the cost of either new impoundments. And so that is a contractual guarantee that is part of that project, but also not just new impoundments within the provincial borders of Quebec, but also looking at neighboring regions and the knock-on effect of needing to import power, and would that incur additional demand spikes from fossil fuel generators, whether in Ontario or in other neighboring jurisdictions. And that has been a major focus to ensure avoidance thereof. And with regards to alternative capacity availability, this has been an interesting story back and forth, and I've lived a good part of it, looking at the Hydro-Quebec onshore wind tenders, in 2018, 2019, when I was with Enercon. We won the better part of 2 gigawatts as part of those solicitations. And the the enormity of onshore resources as well in Quebec, and its balancing need for that hydro is not to be discounted. So, we love all of our renewable energy children equally, even if I have a preference for offshore wind. But nevertheless, those resources are huge and will need to continue to be substantially implemented and stewarded.
What I would want to add to that is this is not just about serving Quebec's winter peak or reliability, strictly speaking. Bidirectional transmission is all about lowering costs by exchanging power when one region has surplus and the other can save money. The whole idea of sending offshore wind to Quebec when New England can't use it means Quebec can save water in its dams and use it later, so Quebec can use its resources more efficiently. I also don't want to forget about the fact that, resistance baseboard heating, a huge opportunity to not build new dams, but reduce load by relying on much more cost-effective and efficient heat pumps and things like that. But this is really about reducing costs by exchanging power between the regions when one region has a surplus and the other region can save costs.
What I'd add to those excellent remarks too is that not trying to speak for Hydro-Quebec, but more speaking as a sort of system modeler, when we try to model a decarbonized future in this region, we have let the model choose. Is it cost optimal to build new dams? And we found that generally it is not. And the way to understand that is low carbon power systems, they are mainly about two things. I would say one is we need energy, we need low carbon energy. And secondly, we need flexibility to get that energy both across space and across time to when and where we need it. And if we require more energy, a very cheap and cost-effective source of energy is renewables, wind, onshore, offshore, as well as solar. And then we can use the flexibility in the existing hydropower dams to get that energy across time to when we need it. This is what we see in our modeling. And I think it's actually what you see reflected somewhat if you read the news that are coming out of Hydro-Quebec and their plans to focus on building onshore wind and maybe, well, I'm actually not sure about the split between onshore and offshore, but they have announced a 10 gigawatt plan, expansion plan of 10 gigawatts of wind that they want to build. So I think that just kind of reflects what we see in the modeling as well. If we want energy, renewables are a great source of that. And the existing hydro, what we find is provides plenty of flexibility.
Excellent. Great remarks, Emil and all. Appreciate it. So let's zoom in on offshore wind for a moment as a complementary resource. We've got some very wonky questions from our audience about transmission topology options for offshore wind, which is like, wow, okay, let's do it. Let's go in. So one question is, how do differences in offshore transmission topologies affect upgrades in onshore transmission that might be part of a bidirectional network, so to speak? How will this affect deploying offshore wind at scale across the full coastline of the region? And relatedly, what policy interventions are needed to speed up the adoption and sort of the, Adrian, I think the word is interoperability of different transmission solutions that are brought to bear from different regions. So again, a large but also deep and wonky question. Have at it, whoever wants the first bite.
Hannes, you should take this. We worked extensively on this together when I was at New York. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it matters a lot where you bring offshore wind to shore. You don't necessarily want to have the nearby substation that doesn't have the capability to absorb a lot of offshore wind. But if you bring offshore wind closer to population centers like into Boston or into New York City, you're better off than bringing offshore wind to the edge of Long Island or some other weaker portions of the grid. As you bring offshore wind to New York City, for example, you might find that the Champlain-Hudson Express line goes to New York City. So you almost create a link between New York offshore wind and Quebec right there. So thinking about these pieces, I think, is what proactive planning is about. You don't just want to go for the lowest cost solution that works in this instant. You really want to have a bigger picture and a longer term picture to make sure. Sometimes transmission is one of these things where you have to spend money to save money. And you might have to spend to upsize transmission, get it to a better spot in order to save money by taking advantage of these types of opportunities.
I want to piggyback just off of that observation, Hannes, if I can, thinking about the terms cost and investment, right? And this is, I think, a big part of what is challenging in this current circumstance, right? There's a lot of focus on, the cost of renewables, the cost of onshore wind, on cost of offshore wind, and I think we are doing the resources and the clean energy transition writ large a huge disservice in looking at the individual sticker price of a single project as the hallmark of what the system costs are. And that's exactly what we're discussing here, right? Is the cost efficiencies of transmission, the cost efficiencies that are associated with interconnecting regions. And so it's really the question of the portfolio cost, and the portfolio cost today and the portfolio cost in 20 years, 30 years. And what we see across the board, which is a delicate subject, is price suppression, right? That's what happens when you've amortized a significant portion of capital and investments in order to bring these projects to bear. And then afterwards, they're delivering free electricity. So, how we get through this part of the journey is important. And in addition to that, the underinvestment in transmission facilities is putting a huge amount of emphasis. The amount of investments between the 70s through today. We're talking about 50 years almost of either disinvestment or substantially slow investment on these types of initiatives. So we're playing catch up in a big way in order to promote, a 21st century that is predicated upon electricity. And so it feels like a lot to bear, but it's very much in line with what we need as, core infrastructure in society.
And I mean, one thing I would also want to emphasize, we're not necessarily talking about all new transmission lines and the permitting that's associated with this. We have an existing grid that was built in the 60s and 70s. It's aging out. It needs to be upgraded. Sometimes we can upsize aging existing lines to double their or triple their throughput. And so there's a lot of opportunity that if we plan comprehensively, say, well, the immediate need is to rebuild that aging line. But if we look ahead, say, well, maybe we rebuild it at a high voltage level and double the throughput. So we can save money and reduce community impacts by better planning. And the same is true with hydro. We don't want to build new dams, but we want to get the most value out of the existing dams. And bidirectional transmission and using these dams in concert with short-term duration batteries in New England is getting more out of the existing system. It saves us money, it saves us community, it reduces community impact, and it gets to a more reliable system.
Great point, Hannes.
Yeah, excellent. We're nearing the end of our time, so let's squeeze in a few more minutes here. I have the sense we could go for another hour or two, but we've talked a lot about Quebec, New York, and Southern New England. I do want to give some love to other provinces and states. We have a question in on sort of thoughts on better bidirectional flow between Maine, New Brunswick, and by extension, PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. I will note last week the DOE in the US awarded a contractual commitment or capacity commitment to a proposed onshore line to bring wind from northern Maine down into New England. I believe that stops short of the Canadian border, if I'm recalling correctly. But we also have this Gulf of Maine offshore wind solicitation for lease areas coming up soon later this month. So how do we think about the Maritimes provinces, northern New England, the linkages thereof, and how they fit in potentially either through onshore or offshore linkages around, again, that bidirectional system?
Well, I think true interregional planning will have to figure out what every region can contribute to the larger northeastern portion of the Americas here. Whether it's northern Maine or New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, they all play a role in this. We have existing infrastructure with the Atlantic Loop going to Muskrat Fall and Churchill Falls. I think better planning allows us to utilize that infrastructure better and diversify resources. I mean, of course, we have to recognize the Canadian Maritimes are much smaller in terms of grid size, population size than Quebec and Ontario. But so the transmission solutions might be smaller than the transmission solutions to the larger portions of the Northeast, but they absolutely have a role to play, including in the offshore wind space.
I think one, looking at Atlantic Canada hats off to the leadership of Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia, for pursuing Bill C-49 as aggressively as they have over the past number of years, and a tremendous amount of planning towards unlocking potential offshore resources. The Atlantic provinces have, real need for cost-effective delivery of power. They have real needs for decarbonization. And part of what is so challenging is that because it's a relatively light load, right, smaller populations, it's hard to bring those necessary investments to bear in a way that is, again, time sensitive to the arc of change in making significant infrastructure investments now. And so the opportunity to share that cost as well as sharing those future benefits is yet another important argument for interregional and cross-border collaboration. And I would say, a big part of what is being considered in Atlantic Canada is also the opportunity to create green hydrogen and a potential export with European nations who are looking for, deep decarbonization, the last pathway in their hard-to-abate sectors, and looking to hydrogen as a potential source. And, the ability to have a reliable, politically stable, friendly partner in Atlantic Canada is very compelling as part of your, global portfolio and energy risk considerations. But the problem is that if there aren't connections, that's a lot of pressure to put on offshore wind to be able to deliver that size of green hydrogen and to be the only offtake source to make that green hydrogen competitive. So there's really an integrated picture here of not only serving immediate electrification and decarbonization, but also in potentially driving future export opportunities and global economic opportunities.
Great, thank you, Adrian. We're just about at time. I'm gonna make a moderator's discretion call to give Emil the last word here with a final question, which is just to explain a little bit more about the sort of weather and climate. The word is used as reciprocity, or I think in your presentation, correlation between and across the sort of the macro region here. So demand, net demand, how do we think about a system that is hopefully larger than the weather systems that we may see in the future?
Sure. So that has to do with sort of everything that is weather related in the future, which will be more of our resources will be dependent on meteorology. And so on the one hand, we care about how correlated our demands are, and on the other, how correlated our renewable energy resources are. what we, should be doing is we plan actual investments and dollars invested in projects is detailed studies with multi-years of data where we can say exactly how well correlated the different wind resources are, for example, and how much balancing we get just by expanding transmission between two different wind turbines, for example. We see that benefit in our studies, and that is what planning looks like, is to do more of that at a sort of interannual scale. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that bidirectional trade is beneficial, is simply the geographical smoothing, as we call it in the modeling world, between the different renewable resources. So that is not even anything to do with hydro. But of course, hydro is the other main reason why we want to integrate the regions, because the reservoir hydropower resource in Hydro-Quebec is this very special resource, which not every country has and not every region has, but it can provide long duration storage that can go on top of this geographical smoothing. So, I mean, yes, I agree with the person that asked the question. That is a key aspect of, integrating the regions closer. And is together with the hydro is sort of a complementary ingredient to our low carbon recipe.
Excellent. Well, a great word to end on there. As I said, I think we could go on for much more time. We did leave a few additional questions on the sidelines, so apologies for that. We'll see if we can get some written Q&A responses around in our roundup email. But please join me in giving a large virtual round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Emil, Hannes, Adrian, all of our attendees, and all of the folks behind the scenes, including Sam Bierstow, who's been ably running this very smooth PowerPoint panel. So until next time, thank you again for joining us. Hope you learned something and hope you're feeling inspired about the opportunities that exist in this region for grid and for decarbonization and beyond. So I think that's how we'll wrap it up. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.